Welcome to this webinar, Information Management in BIM Models with LastBIM. In this session, we will walk through the process to the well-attributed BIM models that we need in order to use building information modeling. And while we do that, we will answer questions like why are clear information requirements essential for this process? What options exist to define and exchange those requirements? How does the definition of those information requirements look like in LastBIM? And then we will also look how LastBIM supports the attribution of the models in Revit and Co. and how I can ensure that every required property is actually included in the BIM model. Let's start with a small background about myself. I worked in a BIM department of an engineering office, Schlüsselplan, and was there confronted with the topic attribution and model quality. And this was also where I experienced how prone to errors this whole process is. And that's what motivated us to develop our platform and plugin solution. Okay, so you're probably also here because you experience some struggles with model quality and you want models that are correctly attributed, either in position of receiving those models or creating those models. And that's good because we need those well-attributed BIM models because only they enable us to run all those model-based workflows in design phase, construction, or facility management, because only the geometry is nice to look at, but to make the BIM models really useful, we also need some more information. And so the question is, how do we achieve that the model contain all the information that we need? So how do we get there? First of all, we always need to define the requirements. When we do not know what information we need, then we can also not make sure that the model has all the information. So we need to know what information is necessary for our use cases and define this as precise and clear as possible as a foundation for the coming attribution. So that's the next step, the attribution, where we will actually enrich our models with the information according to the defined requirements. And then ideally we also have a quality assurance to make sure that all the models actually contain the required information. So the requirement definition here in the beginning is the foundation for all the processes that come afterwards. When I'm not clear and precise here, then it's predictable that misunderstandings and errors will follow in the next steps. And also what I do not define here, I cannot expect to be delivered afterwards. So the information requirements are quite essential for our data quality in the BIM projects because they are the foundation for the attribution process. Because of that, we will have a look at it now and see what are those information requirements at all. So in our definition of information requirements, we should answer at least the following 5 questions. The first one is the definition of the object groups that we need specific requirements for. So when I have requirements for a window, then I have one object group for the windows. When I have specific requirements for different kind of walls, then I have different object groups for the different kind of walls that I can then define the requirements for. And also very important always is to decide how do I classify them, because when I am later in the model, then I have to be able to identify for an element what object group it belongs to. So I know what requirements I have to apply on them and check then later. So this is the first one. Then of course come the properties. So I have to define what information do I need and what should it look like. So what should be the name of the properties, the data type, in which property sets do I expect them to be, and also maybe I have some specific requirements for the values of the properties, so value lists that need to be used or value areas where the property has to be in. So I can make sure that the data in the models also is consistent with those values that I need later. Those two questions are about the content. We then also have some questions about the context. So mostly not every information is there and required directly at the beginning, but the information need increases over time of the project. So in the beginning, I typically have less information that has to be delivered, and later more information is required. So to make sure that every information is delivered on time, I have to define when I need it. Also, not every discipline has every information. The most information are only in some discipline models, and especially for some elements that are shared across different disciplines, for example, like a wall that is used for the structural engineering, but also for the architecture. There I have to define who or in which discipline I expect the information to be delivered. And then I also always would recommend to be clear about why I need specific information. So for what use case do I need this? Because we do not want any information in our models, but only those that we really need. Because as a client, we do not want to pay for any information. And as a planner, of course, we do not want to deliver anything that is not actually needed. Okay, so this is what I will mean with the term of information requirements, and these are also the 5 questions that we want to take a look at later in LastBIM. To define those information requirements, there are different options. First of all, the one that probably most of you are most familiar with are the good old Excel files or also Word and PDF documents. In my opinion, they are great to get started with the topic information requirements, to brainstorm and make some first notes. And they might be also sufficient for smaller projects where the requirements are not that extensive. But when the requirements get more and more extensive and also complex, it will become more and more difficult also to manage those requirements, to have an overview of your requirements, to keep them consistent, and to ensure that there are no version conflicts, as one person has one Excel file and another person has another. So it's easy that some version conflicts happen. Instead, for larger project, or when you need to make the manage the requirements more professional, I would recommend to use database solutions that are specialized on defining and managing those information requirements. Those solutions will help you by having a centralized definition and management of the requirements, so there are no version conflict because everyone works with the exact same data. And they will also help you to improve the consistency and therefore the quality of the requirements itself. For example, by reducing duplicates, redundancies in your catalog that might then lead to inconsistencies. One topic that I cannot leave out in this context is the IDS standard. It is a standard that was published last year in 2024 by Building Smart. And it is an open, standardized and machine-readable data format. With that, you can exchange information requirements between our project participants in a software-neutral way. And you can also import those files then, for example, as checking rules into different BIM softwares like BIM Collab or Solibri, so that everyone can check their model, the IFC models, with those IDS files. Those IDS files also have to be created somehow, and for that, the database solutions, for example, mostly have an export option, so the IDS file can then be generated from the requirements in the database. Okay, so I also already mentioned in the last slide that LastBIM is such a database solution to define those requirements. So we have a platform for this, and you can also exchange or generate IDS files to exchange those requirements. But with LastBIM, we also have one other possibility, which is unique about LastBIM. And these are our integrations into existing BIM software, like for example Revit, where we have a plugin that provides the information requirements from the platform directly into the software of the planner. This will prevent issues in the naming of the properties, in the data types, and so on, because it will generate the properties automatically. And it will then also lead the planner through the attribution process, show him where he has to attribute which properties. And then, as we can see here in the screenshot already, is then also a quality check where he can see directly in the authoring software if he had missed anything. So the goal with this plugins is to prevent all the issues before they're actually happening, instead of checking the model afterwards and then correcting the issues. So we learned that the requirements are the foundation for the attribution, and when we invest time here in the requirement definition, then we will have much less trouble later on with the attribution and the model quality. And for that, this platform that we see now is the starting point. So here we will manage our information requirements, meaning whenever a new project starts, which has project-specific information need, then we can create a new project here on LastBIM, where we will then set up and manage the information requirements for this project, invite all the project participants so that everyone has access to those requirements, and then use those requirements via IDS or our integrations. So when I create a new project, I do not have to start from zero. If I already had a project with well-defined requirements, then I can use this here as a template. So this former project will be copied, and then I have the same requirements as a starting point in my new project, where I can then adjust them to the needs of the new project. Or when you have cross-project requirements that you need again and again, like an internal standard in your company, then you can also mark your requirements here on the platform as a standard instead of a project. Those requirements will be here separated from the projects as standards, and you can then use them directly as a template for a new project. So you will always have a common starting point. So in this project, we already have one catalog. This catalog is basically the digitized Excel file. When we look into it, we will find here the 5 questions that we discussed before for the definition of information requirements. And these are first the definition of the different object groups that we have requirements for. These are here named specifications, based on the term that's used in the IDS standard. And then secondly, the properties, where we define what information is required and how does it look like. Then here you can already see the assignment of specifications and properties to the different domains. So we can define who is responsible for what information. And then here at the bottom, you find the when. So here are the German project phases used in this project to define when an information is required. And we also have the German use cases here in this example that are used to define why an information is required. Those two here in the bottom, the project phases and use cases, are the information levels here on LastBIM and are also customizable for your own needs. So maybe you have some milestones instead, but any other assignment, but we will come back to this later. Let's start with the specifications. Here you can define what kind of objects you have that you want to define specific requirements for. So when you have requirements for doors, then you will have one specification for those doors. And when you have different requirements for different kind of walls, then you will have one specification for each wall type. As you can see, you can group those specifications. Like here we have a group of walls that group the different wall types. And we also have here one group of all the specifications belonging to structural engineering and architecture, and one group for all the technical building equipment. These groups will, on the one side, help you with navigating through your catalog and keeping an overview of your specifications. And on the other side, it will help you with managing the requirements more efficiently, because when we later define the requirements for each of the specifications, we cannot only do it here on the last level, but we can also define requirements for groups of specifications. So for example, when I have requirements that apply to all wall types, then I can define them here on the walls group instead of defining it for each of the wall types. And this way I can also define general requirements that are applied to every kind of object. Those I can define here, for example, on this overarching specification where all the other components are subordinated. In this way, I can reduce the redundancies in my catalogs, so I won't have to define every requirement for each of the object groups, but I can take out the duplicates and the redundancies and manage those general requirements in one central space. To make this a bit more understandable, let's dive into the walls, for example, and let's look at the requirements that we have here. So when I now go into one of the specifications, I can define here what requirements apply for elements that belong to this specification. In this case, we have now the walls, and here in the table with the properties, I can define what properties are required for all the elements that belong to the walls specification. So for example, we have the property building name, building number, and so on. And as you can already see here, some properties are here grouped under inherited and have this little arrow here in the front, and other properties are specification properties. And those are the only properties here that are assigned explicitly to the walls. And all the other properties here in the group inherited are inherited from the groups that this wall specification belongs to. So when we go here into this hierarchy again, then we see that the walls belong to these two groups. And for example, here on the components, we already have defined some general requirements like the building name and building number. And those are properties that are required for all the components from structural engineering, architecture, and the MEP. And this way I did not have to define for every specification that I will need the building name and the building number there, but this is inherited from this group components. Now, next to the properties that are required by the specifications, there's another very important topic, which is the classification. And this classification defines when the specification is actually applied to an element in the model. And in this case, it is done by using the IFC entities. So for example, here we have defined that every element that is an IFC wall will be checked against the requirements for walls. We can also use properties for this classification. So when we have a look at the exterior wall, for example, there we will also find the IFC entity IFC wall. But now to differentiate if it what kind of wall it is, we see here that the property is external is used. So whenever an element is an IFC wall and the property is external, has the value true, then we know that it is an exterior wall and the requirements that are listed here have to be applied to the element. In this way, we can also use classifying properties alone without IFC entities. For example, if we have some system code as a property that defines exactly what kind of object group an element belongs to, then we can of course also use this property as a free classification. So very important, because only with those clear conditions we can check the model in an automated way if every element meets the requirements. Okay, enough about the specifications. We already touched the topic properties. Those properties exist here in a central property database, meaning that once we have defined a property here in our catalog, we can use it again and again for the different specifications that we have. So for example, here we have the length. We already saw it in the walls specification, but it is also linked in the strip foundation as a requirement. And this has now the advantage that as it's only one property, one definition of the property that is used in different specifications, we also only have to edit those property once to then have the changes in every specification. So for example, if we decide here that we also want the unit in the property name, then we could change it here in this general property definition, and then this change will be automatically applied to any place where the property is in use. Like here, the walls, where we will now see the length with the new name. Next to the name, we can of course also define some other things about the properties. Every property also has a data type. When it's a number, then we can define the unit. Every property is in a property set that I can define custom. And what's then also very valuable is that we can add rules for the property values. Now for length, for example, I could say that it has to be a minimum of 0 or more to have a realistic value in the property. But for example, for a text property like the concrete strength, we can also define specific values that are allowed for this property. Like here we have this list of these 6 values. And this way we can make sure that every property is delivered exactly as we need it to be. So here, for example, we do not want any blank spaces between the C and the numbers. And we also only want exactly those concrete strength classes and not any value. Next to value lists, we have also some other rules options that define how the property value has to look like. Like we can define the length of the text, what it has to start or end with, and we can also use regex, regular expressions. This is an option to define exactly how a property has to look like. This especially comes in handy when you have a type code that always has 3 characters at the beginning, then underscore, then 3 numbers and underscore and anything like that. And this you can define with regex. So that is what you can define for each of the properties. Yeah, so you can define your own properties so that you have exactly those information that you need in your project. If you want to use the IFC standard properties, you can also search for them here in the IFC property database that we have here listed and get your properties. Next up are the information levels. In this case, you will find here the project phases and use cases. The same as for the specifications and properties, you can also define your own information levels. So here we use the project phases and the use cases to define the when and why, but maybe you have some custom milestones or the project phases that are used in your country, then you can use them here instead. The information levels that you define here will then be displayed here in the specifications and the requirements. So for every information level, we will find a column here in the back. For example, here for the project phase 3, we can then define what of the properties is required in this phase. And as we had this combination of project phases and use cases in this project, we can also unfold this, and then we will find the use cases, and with that I can now define for what use case in which project phase I need the information. The last question that is still open is the who. So we had the which objects, we had the information, we had the when and the why. And now here you can already see the domains, and with them I can now differentiate which information is delivered by which domain or in which model. So this is also what I can define for each of the properties here with the domain and say who is responsible for that. Okay, so now we have defined everything that we need in our information requirements, and we want to provide those requirements to our project participants. And for that, we can either use the IDS export or the integrations. Let's start with the IDS export. So we will have here an export option for IDS. And when exporting the IDS, we can filter the requirements, so we get exactly those requirements that we need right now at the moment for the model that we want to check with the IDS file. Because we never only have one IDS file in our project, because when we check a model against one IDS file, we always check it against the whole IDS. So when we have different project phases, we will need different IDS file for each project phase. When we have different domains, then it multiplies by the domains, and when we even want to differentiate by use case, then it will also multiply by use cases. And that's why a database solution like LastBIM makes a lot of sense, because there you can manage all the requirements at once, and then you can extract those requirements into the IDS file that you need at the moment. So here we can now for example, say that we want to check an architecture model in the project phase 3, and maybe we want to differentiate what use cases, or I just leave this field empty and will have every use case in my IDS file. Here in the bottom we see some other filters. Those are tags. These are basically additional categories or filters that you can add in your catalog to categorize your requirements by custom categories. So in this case we have a building type and a status, and for example this status here marks those requirements that are already coordinated and those requirements that still have to be discussed in the next meeting, for example. So this is the IDS export that I can use. I already mentioned we also have the option to use one of our integrations to use those requirements directly within our BIM software. We are now here in Revit to see how the plugin works here. You already see it here on the right. I'm here logged into my account, so the plugin knows what projects I have access to, so I can select what project I am working on. And then, just as we saw it for the export of the IDS, I can also here filter the requirements so that they match the information need for this model. For example, here I can select the project phases. I can say on which use cases this model is for and for what domain I am working. We also find the filters here again with the status, for example, where I could say I only want those requirements that are already final and coordinated, and so that I do not have to work on the other requirements that are not final yet. So when I set up my requirements here, then I can start the plugin. The plugin will then compare the parameters that already exist here in the Revit project with the requirements that are defined on the platform. So in this case here, it now recognizes that most of the parameters are still missing. So these parameters have to be created. And when I now click on synchronizing, then this will be done automatically by the plugin, which will make sure that the naming is correct of the properties and also that the properties are created with the correct data type. So I do not have to manage the parameters manually on my own because this will be done here by the plugin. Also, for example, here when the name is updated on the platform, here it was, for example, translated from German to English, then also the name will be updated so that the parameters in my Revit project are always up to date. So let's synchronize, and now that I've synchronized the parameters, I'm ready to start with attributing, so I do not have to set up anything else. I can just go right into the attribution. For that, I select the elements that I want to add the properties to. And here it recognizes now, based on the IFC mapping of the element, that these elements are walls. So the requirements of the specification walls will be applied to those elements. And here we now see the properties that are required for the selected elements, filtered by the project phase that we selected, the use cases, domains, and so on. So I do not have to look up manually which properties I now have to fill in for these elements, because the plugin will show me exactly what is relevant for these elements. So I just have to pick here the values when there are value lists. So for example, here for the status, these are the value lists that we saw before on the platform, where we have now only these 4 values that are allowed for this property. So I cannot write demolished or anything else instead of demolition, and we have coherent data within the whole model, and also no differences between different models. Here for the building name, there was another rule defined on the platform that the property value has to start with BW_, and those rules are then also validated in real time here in the plugin, so that I directly see that this value is not valid, and I can correct it immediately. On the bottom, we see this progress bar, so I always see how far I actually am with attribution and if I have missed anything. So now, for example, we still have 3 properties to do and the rest is okay. Now we are done. The progress bar here indicates that I'm done with these elements and I've not forgotten anything. And now I could go on and go to the other elements and continue with the attribution. Next to the attribution, we have another module here in the plugin, and that is the validation. The validation allows me to run a model check over the entire model, so I can use my current view, for example, and check all the visible elements. And then I see directly here in Revit where properties are still missing and which elements are correctly attributed. You can also color the model so we can see it directly in the model where properties are still missing. We see here the 3 walls that we've attributed before, and can see again that we've done our job good and did not miss anything. And all the other elements are either red because properties are missing or are invalid, and other elements are gray because those are even unclassified, so we don't know what kind of elements these are and what requirements they have to fulfill. So now with these results, I can go back into the attribution. I can see, okay, the columns, there is the building name missing, building number, and so on. And then I can go back to the attribution and fix these problems immediately and do not have to export the model to IFC, for example, to then check it in another software, because I can check it on my own here in Revit. So these were the main features of the LastBIM plugin with the attribution and the model checking to ensure the data quality in the model, and the platform that we saw before for the definition of the requirements. And what we want to achieve with both of them is that we have a high data quality right from the start. So we do not want the issues to happen in the first place. So we have to search for them and correct them, which can take a lot of time. But we want to enable everyone to deliver the right data quality right from the start. And for this, we need this clear definition of the data structures of or the information requirements, so that everyone knows what needs to be delivered and how the models have to look like. And then we need a way to exchange and communicate these requirements, either via IDS or with LastBIM via the plugins, so that the model authors can actually work with them and ensure the data quality in the model. So that's it for this session. I hope you could get some helpful insights about the topic information requirements in general, why they are so important and how you can work with them. And also, of course, how the workflow can look like with LastBIM. If you have any questions, then feel free to reach out to us, either via email, or you can always book a discovery call where we can discuss this topic more in detail with your use cases in a one-on-one meeting. So thank you for your attention and see you next time.